The night they threw me out, the wind was screaming like it knew exactly what was happening, rain slashing sideways as my daughter-in-law stood in the doorway gripping the frame and shouted that her mother deserved this house because she raised her, while my son stared at the floor and said nothing, and before I could even answer, they pushed me and the only soul still loyal to me, my old dog, straight into the storm, the door slamming shut behind us as if years of sacrifice meant nothing. I remember the cold biting through my coat, my dog shaking beside me, and the sound of laughter drifting from inside as her mother settled into my home like it had always been hers, and in that moment I realized this was not anger or misunderstanding, it was betrayal planned and justified with fake morality. I stood there soaked, humiliated, holding my dog close, knowing they believed I was powerless, disposable, finished, because they thought everything I had was already taken from me. What they did not know was that the man they abandoned in the rain had already secured something far more powerful than their cruelty, something that would turn their certainty into panic and their confidence into collapse. This is not just a story about being kicked out of a house. It is about how quickly family can turn when greed whispers in their ear, and how silence can be just as cruel as shouting. Stay with me, because what happened in the next 24 hours shattered their sense of control, exposed every lie they built their comfort on, and proved that patience and dignity can be far more devastating than rage. And by the end of this story, you will understand why every storm eventually chooses who it breaks and who it makes unbreakable. My name is Robert Finch. I am 68 years old, a retired businessman who spent 4 decades building something from nothing, and a widower who lost the love of his life 3 years ago to cancer. I thought I knew what grief felt like. I was wrong. The storm arrived without warning that October night, but what happened inside the house cut deeper than any thunder. I was sitting in my reading chair, the same one Eleanor had picked out for me 20 years ago, when Vanessa stormed into the living room with a look I had seen building for months. Marjorie stood behind her daughter like a shadow, arms crossed, chin lifted. My son Ethan lingered near the doorway, his eyes fixed on his phone, refusing to meet my gaze. "We need to talk about the living situation," Vanessa announced, though her tone made clear this would not be a conversation, it would be a verdict. I set down my book. Buddy, my 10-year-old golden retriever, lifted his head from his paws and watched the room with the same wariness I felt in my chest. "This house belongs to people who contribute," Vanessa continued, her voice rising. "People who work, people who matter. Not someone who just sits around waiting to die." The words hung in the air like smoke. I looked at Marjorie, who nodded approvingly, as though her daughter had finally said what needed saying. Then I looked at Ethan, my only son, the boy I had taught to ride a bicycle, the young man I had helped through college, the adult I had welcomed into this home when he said he wanted to take care of me after his mother passed. He did not look up from his phone. "You've had 3 years to figure out your next chapter," Vanessa pressed on. "We've been patient, we've been generous, but this is our home now, Robert. Ours, and we can't keep carrying dead weight. Dead weight." That is what I had become to them. 43 years of marriage to Eleanor, 45 years of raising a son, a lifetime of building, providing, sacrificing, and in the end, I was dead weight. I should have been angry. Any reasonable man would have shouted, argued, demanded respect in his own house. But as I sat there, looking at the 3 faces arranged against me, I felt something else entirely. I felt confirmation. For 136 Vanessa, Prinessa, changing the locks without telling me, my mail disappearing before I could read it. Visitors turned away at the door. Bank statements I had seen it all. I had simply been waiting to see what Ethan would do. Now I had my answer. I rose slowly from the chair, my knees protesting the way they always did now. Buddy immediately stood with me, pressing his warm body against my leg. "Where do you think you're going?" Vanessa demanded. I did not answer. I walked to the hallway closet and retrieved my coat, the old wool one Eleanor had bought me on our 30th anniversary. I picked up the small bag I had quietly packed 2 weeks ago, when I first realized this night was coming. Buddy followed without hesitation. Vanessa stepped in front of me, confusion flickering across her face. "Why aren't you even fighting back?" I looked at her. Then I looked past her, at my son, who still would not raise his eyes. "Some battles," I said quietly, "are not won by fighting." I moved toward the front door, pausing only once. On the wall beside the entrance hung our wedding photo. Eleanor at 23, radiant in white, her hand in mine. We had hung that picture the day we moved in, and I had looked at it every single day since. Even after she was gone, I would stop there each morning and remember what it felt like to be loved by someone who saw me completely. I touched the frame gently. "I'm sorry," I whispered, though I was not sure if I was apologizing to her or to myself. Then I opened the door. The rain hit my face like needles of ice. The wind howled through the trees. Behind me, I heard Vanessa say something sharp to Ethan, and I heard Marjorie's satisfied murmur. But I did not turn around. Buddy and I stepped into the storm, and the door slammed shut behind us. They thought I had nothing left. They thought I was a broken old man with no options and no fight remaining. What they did not know, what they could not have imagined, was that Eleanor had been watching them for years, and she had prepared me for exactly this moment. Buddy and I found shelter that night in a small motel off the highway, the kind of place Eleanor and I would have laughed about in our younger days. The room smelled of old carpet and industrial cleaner, but it was dry and warm, and the woman at the front desk did not ask questions when she saw a soaking wet old man walk in with a dog and a single bag. I paid cash, took the key, and sat on the edge of the bed while Buddy curled up at my feet. The rain continued to pound against the window, and in that dim room, surrounded by nothing familiar, I found myself doing what I had tried so hard not to do for 3 years. I let myself remember Eleanor. We met in the summer of 1978 at a church picnic in Virginia. She was 23, I was 25, and I knew within 5 minutes of talking to her that I would marry her if she would have me. She laughed at my jokes, even the bad ones. She challenged my opinions without making me feel small. And when she looked at me, I felt seen in a way I had never experienced before. We married that December, in a small ceremony with 30 guests and a cake her mother baked herself. We had nothing but each other and a dream of building something meaningful. Over the next 4 decades, we did exactly that. I started a manufacturing business that grew beyond anything I had imagined. Eleanor managed our home, raised Ethan, and eventually became my most trusted advisor in every decision that mattered. She had instincts I lacked, a way of reading people that bordered on supernatural. When she told me not to trust a business partner, I listened. When she said a deal felt wrong, I walked away. She was never once mistaken. We built a beautiful life. The house, the savings, the investments, all of it was ours together. But what I treasured most was not the money or the property. It was the partnership, the knowledge that no matter what happened in the world outside, I had someone in my corner who would never abandon me. When she was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer 5 years ago, something inside me shifted. The doctors gave her 2 years at most. She lived for 3, because Eleanor never did anything on anyone else's timeline. I retired from business immediately and devoted myself to her care. I drove her to every appointment, held her hand through every treatment, and slept in a chair beside her hospital bed during the worst nights. I would have done it for another 30 years if she had needed me. In her final year, Eleanor began saying things I did not fully understand. She would look at me with those sharp eyes of hers and say, "Promise me you'll protect yourself when I'm gone." I would nod and tell her not to worry, assuming she meant financially, practically. She would shake her head slightly, as though I had missed the point, but she never explained further. There were phone calls she took in the other room, conversations that ended abruptly when I walked in. There were afternoons when she said she was meeting an old friend, though she never mentioned names. I did not ask questions. After 43 years of marriage, I had learned that Eleanor revealed things in her own time, in her own way. I trusted her completely. I still do. She passed on a Tuesday morning in April, holding my hand, with sunlight streaming through the bedroom window. Her last words to me were simple. "You are stronger than you know, Robert. Remember that." I buried her on a hillside overlooking the valley where we had built our life, and I thought the worst of my pain was behind me. I was wrong. Vanessa called 3 days after the funeral. Her voice was soft with practiced concern as she suggested that she and Ethan move into the house to help me through my grief. I was too hollowed out to think clearly. I said yes. Within a month, they had occupied the guest rooms, rearranged the kitchen, and begun speaking of the house as though it had always been theirs. 1 year later, Marjorie arrived. Vanessa explained that her mother was lonely and needed family around her. I did not argue. I was still trying to find my footing in a world without Eleanor, and I told myself that a full house might ease the silence. But the silence did not ease. It deepened. Slowly, room by room, decision by decision, the home Eleanor and I had built together stopped feeling like mine. My opinions were dismissed, my preferences ignored, my presence treated as an inconvenience rather than a right. Eleanor had warned me. She had tried to prepare me for something she saw coming long before I did, but I had been too focused on losing her to understand what she was really saying. I didn't understand what Eleanor meant. Until the night they threw me into the rain. The morning after the storm, I woke in that motel room with Buddy's head resting on my chest and a clarity I had not felt in months. The rain had stopped sometime before dawn, and pale sunlight filtered through the thin curtains. I lay there for a long moment, listening to my dog breathe, and I allowed myself to feel something other than grief. I felt vindicated. What Vanessa and Marjorie did not know, what even Ethan could not have guessed, was that the night they threw me out was not a surprise. I had seen it coming for 6 months. I had watched every move they made, cataloged every slight, and waited, not because I was weak, because I needed to know the truth about my son. The signs had begun appearing shortly after Marjorie settled into the house. Small things at first, easy to dismiss. Vanessa changed the locks on the front door without telling me, claiming the old ones were faulty. My bank statements stopped arriving in the mail. When I asked about them, she said she had set up electronic delivery to reduce clutter. Old friends who used to visit began calling less, and when I reached out to them, they mentioned that Vanessa had told them I was unwell and needed rest. I am 68 years old, not senile. I know when I am being isolated. The financial control came next. Vanessa offered to help manage the household accounts, presenting it as a kindness. Within weeks, I discovered that my name had been removed from 2 credit cards and that checks from my investment accounts were being rerouted to a joint account I had never authorized. When I confronted her, she smiled and said it was all for my protection. Old people get confused, she explained, as though I were a child who had wandered into an adult conversation. I could have stopped it then. I still had resources, still had connections, still had the sharpness of mind that had built a company from nothing. But I held back. I watched. I waited. Because this was never really about Vanessa or Marjorie. It was about Ethan. My son had always been gentle, perhaps too gentle for his own good. As a boy, he avoided conflict at all costs. As a young man, he drifted toward the path of least resistance in every decision. When he married Vanessa, I hoped she would give him the backbone he lacked. Instead, she consumed him. He became her echo, her instrument, her silent partner in whatever scheme she devised. But he was still my son, and I needed to know if any part of the boy I had raised still existed inside the man he had become. So I gave him chances. When Vanessa first suggested limiting my access to my own accounts, I looked directly at Ethan and asked what he thought. He mumbled something about it being sensible and looked away. When Marjorie moved into the house and began treating me like a tenant in my own home, I waited for Ethan to object. He never did. When visitors were turned away and my mail was intercepted and my world grew smaller by the day, I searched my son's face for any sign of discomfort. There was none. The storm night was the final examination. I knew it was coming. I had seen Vanessa and Marjorie whispering in the kitchen that afternoon, their voices sharp with anticipation. I had watched Ethan retreat to his room, unwilling to be part of the planning, but equally unwilling to warn me. When the confrontation came, I was ready. I was not ready for how much it would hurt to see Ethan standing there, silent, while his wife called me dead weight. I was not ready for the hollow feeling in my chest when he refused to meet my eyes. I had hoped, against all evidence, that in the crucial moment he would choose me. He chose his comfort. He chose his silence. He chose them. But there was one detail that stayed with me through all those months of observation. Ethan had a habit I could not explain. During family conversations, especially when Vanessa and Marjorie discussed their plans, he would clutch his phone tightly, sometimes stepping out of the room to tap at the screen. It happened too often to be coincidence. I did not know what it meant, but I filed it away in my mind, sensing it might matter someday. Now, sitting in that motel room with the storm behind me and an uncertain road ahead, I reached into my bag and found the item I had carried with me for 3 years without opening. An envelope, slightly worn at the edges, with Eleanor's handwriting across the front. Open when you need me. She had given it to me 2 weeks before she died, pressing it into my hands with a look I had never seen before. Fierce, protective, certain. I had promised to wait until I truly needed it. For 3 years I had kept that promise, even when grief made me desperate to hear her voice again in any form. But now, alone in a strange room with my son's betrayal still fresh in my heart, I knew the time had come. I slid my finger under the seal and opened the envelope. Inside the envelope were 3 sheets of paper, covered front and back in Eleanor's careful handwriting. I recognized it immediately, the elegant loops and precise letters she had developed over decades of correspondence. Even in her final year, when the cancer had taken so much from her, her penmanship never wavered. She refused to let the disease steal her dignity. I held the pages gently, as though they might dissolve at my touch, and I began to read. "My dearest Robert," the letter began. "If you are reading this, then the day I feared has finally arrived. I am sorry I could not be there to stand beside you. I am sorry I had to leave you to face this alone, but I want you to know that you are not as alone as you feel right now. I have been preparing for this moment since long before I left you." My hands trembled. Buddy lifted his head, sensing my distress, and pressed closer against my leg. I steadied myself and continued. "I have watched Vanessa carefully for years, Robert. I know you think I was too hard on her, that I judged her unfairly because no woman would ever be good enough for our son. But that was not it. I saw something in her from the very beginning, a coldness beneath the charm, a calculating patience that frightened me. She married Ethan not because she loved him, but because she saw opportunity. I tried to warn you once, and you told me I was being overprotective. You were too kind to see what I saw. That kindness is one of the things I love most about you. It is also your greatest vulnerability." I remembered that conversation. It was shortly after Ethan announced his engagement, nearly 20 years ago. Eleanor had pulled me aside and said she had concerns about Vanessa. I dismissed her worries as maternal anxiety, the natural reluctance of a mother to let go of her only child. I told her to give Vanessa a chance. I told her everything would be fine. Eleanor had nodded and never raised the subject again. I thought she had accepted my judgment. Now I understood she had simply stopped arguing and started preparing. "Vanessa is patient," the letter continued. "She has waited years for her moment, and I believe her mother has been guiding her all along. Marjorie is not the harmless woman she pretends to be. She is the architect of whatever scheme they are running. Together, they will try to take everything from you. The house, the money, your dignity. They will isolate you, control you, and eventually discard you. I have seen this pattern before in the families of friends, and I recognize the signs." My throat tightened as I read her words. Eleanor had seen all of it, years before it happened. She had watched the threat gathering on the horizon while I remained oblivious, focused entirely on her illness, on making her remaining time as comfortable as possible. I had thought I was protecting her. In truth, she had been protecting me. "I want you to find a man named Marcus Whitfield," Eleanor wrote. "He is an attorney in the city, specializing in estate planning and trust law. I met with him several times over the past 2 years, always when you thought I was seeing old friends or attending appointments. I am sorry for the deception, Robert. I could not burden you with my fears while you were already carrying so much. Marcus has everything you need. He will explain what I have done and how it will protect you. Trust him as you would trust me." Marcus Whitfield. I had never heard the name before. Eleanor had kept this entirely separate from our daily life, building some kind of legal structure without my knowledge. The depth of her planning staggered me. Even while fighting for her life, she had found the strength to think about my future, to anticipate threats I could not see. The final page of the letter shifted in tone. Eleanor's handwriting became slightly softer, as though she had paused before continuing. "Now I must ask something difficult of you," she wrote. "Do not blame Ethan too harshly for whatever he has done or failed to do. Our son is not evil, Robert. I truly believe that. He is simply weak. He has always been weak, and we both know that some of that weakness is our fault. We sheltered him too much. We solved his problems instead of teaching him to solve them himself. We raised a boy who cannot stand up to pressure, who will always choose the easiest path even when it leads somewhere shameful." I closed my eyes for a moment, feeling the truth of her words settle into my bones. We had loved Ethan so completely that we had failed to prepare him for a world that would not love him back. "But weakness can be just as dangerous as cruelty," Eleanor continued. A weak man who stands by while evil is done is complicit in that evil. Ethan knows the difference between right and wrong. He simply lacks the courage to act on it. So I ask you this. Give him one chance to prove me wrong. One chance to show that there is still something of the man we hoped he would become. If he fails that chance, then let him go. You cannot save someone who refuses to save himself. I set the letter down and stared at the wall of that small motel room. Outside, the morning light grew stronger. Buddy watched me with patient eyes, waiting for whatever came next. My wife had known everything. She had seen the danger, identified the enemies, and built defenses I did not even know existed. While I was holding her hand through chemotherapy sessions and praying for more time, she was meeting with lawyers and constructing a fortress around our future. My wife had been preparing for war while I was preparing for her funeral. I would learn what happened in that house on the night I left, though not until much later. Ethan's phone, the one he clutched so constantly during family conversations, contained recordings he had been making for 2 years. When I finally heard them, I understood the full scope of what Eleanor had tried to warn me about. The enemy was not just Vanessa. It had never been just Vanessa. The recording from that storm night began shortly after the door slammed behind me. I could hear the rain still pounding against the windows, and Vanessa's voice cutting through it with satisfaction. "Finally," she said. "I thought he would never leave." Marjorie's response was calm, almost bored. "You did exactly what I taught you. Patience and pressure, applied in the right measure. Now we wait for the old man to give up completely." There was the sound of wine being poured, glasses clinking together in celebration. My stomach turned as I listened, but I forced myself to continue. I needed to understand the depth of what I was facing. "Do you think he'll fight back?" Vanessa asked. Marjorie laughed, a dry sound without warmth. "With what? He's a 68-year-old man with no allies and no resources we haven't already cut off. He'll spend a few nights feeling sorry for himself. Then he'll come crawling back, begging to be let in. When he does, we'll be generous. We'll allow him a room in the basement, maybe. Supervised visits with that ridiculous dog. He'll be grateful for scraps, and we'll have complete control." Listening to that recording months later, I marveled at how completely Marjorie had misjudged me. But her confidence was not surprising. She had spent a lifetime perfecting this approach, and I was not her first target. The recordings Ethan made over 2 years painted a detailed portrait of Marjorie Collins, and it was not a flattering one. She had been married once, briefly, to a man named Donald who left her when Vanessa was 7 years old. According to the fragments I pieced together from various conversations, Donald had been unfaithful, cruel, and ultimately abandoning. He emptied their joint accounts, signed the house over to his mistress, and disappeared to Florida with a woman half his age. Marjorie was left with nothing but a daughter and a burning determination that she would never be vulnerable again. She raised Vanessa on a single philosophy, repeated so often it became the foundation of her daughter's entire worldview. A woman's security comes from what she controls, not what she's given. Never depend on anyone. Never trust anyone. Take what you need before they can take it from you. Vanessa absorbed these lessons completely. By the time she met Ethan in her late 20s, she had already ended 2 engagements to men who failed to meet her mother's standards of usefulness. Ethan was different. He was weak, pliable, and most importantly, he came from money. His father had built a successful business. His mother clearly adored him and would never cut him off. He was the perfect target. I do not believe Vanessa ever loved my son. I believe she identified him as an opportunity and pursued him with the same calculated patience her mother had taught her. The wedding, the devoted wife act, the years of playing the dutiful daughter-in-law, all of it was preparation for this moment. Marjorie had drawn the blueprint decades ago. Vanessa simply followed the instructions. On the recording from that storm night, their conversation continued with chilling casualness. "What about Ethan?" Vanessa asked. "He's been acting strange lately." "Your husband is not a concern," Marjorie replied. "He's too weak to cause problems. He'll do whatever you tell him because the alternative requires courage he doesn't have. Men like Ethan are useful precisely because they're predictable. He'll fall in line." There was a pause, and I heard footsteps in the background. Then Vanessa's voice again, slightly irritated. "Where is he going now?" "Probably to sulk in his room," Marjorie said dismissively. "Let him. He'll get over it by morning." Neither woman noticed that Ethan had left with his phone in his hand. Neither woman suspected that their conversation, like so many before it, was being recorded. They were so confident in their control over him that they never considered he might be building a record of their schemes. But the moment that haunted me most came at the end of the recording. The conversation had wound down, the wine bottle emptied, and Marjorie was preparing to retire for the night. I heard her footsteps pause, and then her voice, softer now but no less venomous. She always thought she was smarter than everyone, Marjorie said. Who? Vanessa asked. Eleanor. Your precious mother-in-law. There was contempt in every syllable. The way she used to look at me, like she could see right through me. Like she knew exactly what I was. She thought she was so superior with her perfect marriage and her perfect house and her perfect life. Another pause, and I imagined Marjorie standing before Eleanor's portrait, the one that still hung in the hallway. Turns out she was just like the rest of us, Marjorie continued, dead and forgotten, and now everything she built belongs to me. When I heard those words, months later, I felt something I had not experienced since Eleanor's funeral. Not grief, not anger. Something colder and more patient. Marjorie thought my wife was dead and forgotten. She could not have been more wrong. Marcus Whitfield's office was located on the 3rd floor of a modest building in the business district, the kind of place that successful professionals occupy when they have nothing left to prove. I found it 3 days after the storm, after spending 2 nights in that motel room reading and rereading Eleanor's letter until I had memorized every word. Buddy waited in the car with the windows cracked, watching me with those patient eyes as I walked toward the entrance. The receptionist, a woman in her 50s with reading glasses perched on her nose, looked up when I entered. Can I help you? My name is Robert Finch, I said. I believe you've been expecting me for about 3 years. She studied my face for a moment, then nodded slowly. Please have a seat, Mr. Finch. I'll let Marcus know you're here. I did not have to wait long. Within minutes, a door opened and a man emerged. Marcus Whitfield was perhaps 60 years old, with silver hair and the calm demeanor of someone who had spent decades navigating difficult situations. He extended his hand and gripped mine firmly. Robert, he said, Eleanor told me you would come eventually. I'm only sorry it took circumstances like these to bring you here. He led me into his office, a comfortable room lined with law books and framed certificates. A photograph on his desk showed him with a woman I assumed was his wife, standing on a beach somewhere warm. He gestured for me to sit and took his place behind the desk. How much did Eleanor tell you in her letter? He asked. Enough to know that you have something I need, I replied. Not enough to understand what it is. Marcus nodded and opened a drawer, withdrawing a thick folder that he placed on the desk between us. Then let me start at the beginning. 5 years ago, your wife came to see me. She was already sick, though she hadn't told you yet. She said she needed to put certain protections in place, and she needed to do it without your knowledge. Why without my knowledge? Because she knew you would argue with her. Marcus smiled slightly. She said you were too trusting, too kind, and that you would never believe your own son could betray you. She didn't want to spend her remaining time fighting with you about hypotheticals, so she asked me to help her prepare quietly, and to wait until you needed what she had built. He opened the folder and turned it so I could see the documents inside. The first page bore a title in bold letters, The Eleanor Finch Living Trust. Everything you think you own, Marcus explained, is actually held in this trust. The house, both cars, all investment accounts, even the life insurance policy Eleanor took out years ago. She transferred everything into the trust 5 years ago, with herself as the original trustee. Upon her death, I became the successor trustee, responsible for managing the assets according to her instructions. I stared at the documents, struggling to comprehend the scope of what Eleanor had done. I don't understand. If everything is in a trust, how have Vanessa and Ethan been living there? How have they been accessing the accounts? Because the trust allows for it, under specific conditions. Marcus turned to another section of the folder. Your wife was very precise about this. She wanted Ethan to have the opportunity to be a good son. She didn't want to punish him preemptively for sins he hadn't yet committed, so she built in what I call a testing mechanism. He pointed to a document labeled Beneficiary Agreement. 2 years ago, shortly after Marjorie moved into the house, I sent this agreement to Ethan. It was presented as routine paperwork, something all beneficiaries of a trust need to sign. Vanessa pushed him to sign it quickly, without reading the fine print. She assumed it was just a formality. What does it actually say? Marcus turned to a specific page and indicated a paragraph marked as Clause 7.3. It states, and I quote, "If Robert Finch is forced to leave the residence against his will by any beneficiary or any person acting in concert with a beneficiary, said beneficiary's interest in the trust shall be immediately and irrevocably terminated." The words hit me like a physical force. Eleanor had anticipated exactly what would happen. She had known that Vanessa would eventually push me out, and she had created a trap so elegant that they walked into it without ever realizing it existed. "The night of the storm," I said slowly, "when they threw me out. Triggered clause 7.3, Marcus confirmed. Ethan's beneficiary status was terminated the moment that door closed behind you. He no longer has any legal claim to the house, the cars, or any asset held in the trust. Neither does Vanessa, since she was acting in concert with him. And Marjorie never had any claim to begin with." I sat in silence, absorbing the magnitude of what Eleanor had accomplished. While I was holding her hand through chemotherapy, while I was praying for more time, while I was preparing to say goodbye to the love of my life, she was building a fortress I didn't know existed. "She told me something the last time we met," Marcus said quietly. She was very weak by then, but her mind was as sharp as ever. She said, "I need to protect my husband from my own family. I know how that sounds. I know it seems paranoid. But I have watched Vanessa for 20 years, and I know what she is. When the time comes, make sure Robert has everything he needs to fight back." My eyes burned, but I did not cry. There would be time for tears later. Right now, I needed to focus on what came next. "What do we do now?" I asked. Marcus closed the folder and folded his hands on top of it. "Now we notify them, officially and legally. I have prepared the documents. With your permission, I will have them delivered today." I thought of Marjorie standing before Eleanor's portrait, calling her dead and forgotten. I thought of Vanessa celebrating with wine while I stood in the rain with my dog. I thought of Ethan, silent and complicit, choosing comfort over his own father. "Send them," I said. That afternoon, a courier arrived at the house that was no longer theirs. The doorbell rang, and Vanessa answered, irritated at the interruption. A young man in a uniform handed her a thick envelope bearing the return address of Marcus Whitfield, attorney at law. She signed for it automatically, barely glancing at the paperwork. But when she opened the envelope and began to read the first page, her expression changed. The color drained from her face. Her hands began to shake so badly that the papers rattled. Marjorie appeared behind her. "What is it? What's wrong?" Vanessa could not answer. For the first time since I had known her, she was completely speechless. The recordings Ethan made that evening captured every moment of their unraveling. I listened to them months later in Marcus Whitfield's office, and despite everything they had done to me, I found myself fascinated by how quickly their confidence crumbled. Vanessa recovered from her initial shock within an hour, her denial mechanism snapping into place with practiced efficiency. I could hear her pacing across the hardwood floors, the sharp click of her heels punctuating her words. "This is a bluff," she declared. "It has to be. He's a broken old man with no money, no connections, and no fight left in him. We've controlled his finances for over a year. Where would he even get the resources to hire an attorney?" Marjorie's response was more measured, and that worried Vanessa more than she wanted to admit. "Who is Marcus Whitfield? Have you ever heard that name before?" "Never. He's probably some ambulance chaser Robert found in the phone book. Someone willing to write threatening letters for $100. Then find out," Marjorie said, her voice hardening. "Find out who this man is, what firm he works for, and how long he's been involved with your father-in-law. I don't like surprises, Vanessa. You know that." There was a pause on the recording, and I imagined Vanessa's face tightening at her mother's tone. For all her bravado, Vanessa had never truly escaped Marjorie's control. The dynamic between them was less mother and daughter than commander and soldier. "Fine," Vanessa said, finally. "I'll look into it tomorrow. But I'm telling you, this is nothing. Robert doesn't have the spine for a real fight. He'll threaten and bluster, and then he'll come crawling back when he realizes he has nowhere else to go." But Ethan had remained silent throughout this exchange, and his silence was more telling than any words. Unlike his wife and mother-in-law, Ethan had spent enough time in business settings to understand legal documents. He had read the notice from Marcus Whitfield carefully, parsing every clause and considering every implication, and what he found there had shaken him in ways the women could not comprehend. Later that night, after Vanessa and Marjorie had retired to their rooms, Ethan sat alone in the study that had once been mine. The recording captured the sound of his laptop opening, the soft clicks of his fingers on the keyboard, and then nothing but his breathing for several long minutes. He was looking at a folder on his desktop. I know this because when he eventually gave me the laptop, I saw the folder myself. It was labeled simply Insurance, an innocuous name that revealed nothing of its contents. Inside were 847 files, meticulously organized by date and category. Screenshots of text messages, audio recordings of conversations, photographs of documents, email forwards, bank statements, a complete chronicle of Vanessa and Marjorie's scheme, assembled piece by piece over 24 months. Ethan had begun collecting this evidence 2 years earlier, shortly after he overheard his wife and mother-in-law discussing their long-term plans for my assets. He had been horrified by what he heard, but not horrified enough to confront them, not brave enough to warn me. Instead, he had done what weak men do when faced with moral choices they cannot make. He had hedged his bets. The insurance folder was exactly what its name implied. It was protection against the day when everything fell apart, when the scheme collapsed and someone needed to take the blame. With this evidence, Ethan could prove that he was merely a passive participant, that the real architects of the plan were Vanessa and Marjorie. He could position himself as a victim rather than a perpetrator, a foolish husband manipulated by a cunning wife rather than a willing accomplice in the abuse of his own father. It was cowardice of the most calculated kind. He had watched them isolate me, control me, and ultimately expel me from my own home, all while quietly building a case that would exonerate him if things went wrong. He had never intended to use the evidence to help me. He had gathered it purely to save himself. But now, sitting alone in that study with the legal notice fresh in his mind, Ethan faced a different calculation. The notice made clear that his beneficiary status had been terminated. The house he thought he owned was never his to begin with. The life he had built on my foundation was crumbling beneath his feet, and the insurance he had so carefully assembled might now be his only remaining asset. The recording captured his voice, barely above a whisper, talking to himself in the darkness of that room. "What do I do?" he muttered. "What the hell do I do now?" He did not find an answer that night. He closed the laptop without making a decision, and the recording ended with the sound of him leaving the study and climbing the stairs to the bedroom where his wife waited. I listened to that recording many times in the months that followed, trying to understand the man my son had become. He had the evidence to expose everything. He had the power to end the scheme with a single phone call to me or to the police. He had 847 reasons to do the right thing, and still he hesitated. Ethan knew more than anyone realized. He had documented every conversation, every plan, every betrayal. He held in his hands the complete record of what had been done to me. The question was whether he would use it to save himself or his father. The story of how Ethan became a collector of sins began on a Thursday evening 2 years before the storm, in the kitchen of the house that had once been filled with Eleanor's warmth. I learned the details from the first recording he ever made, a file dated November 14th that captured the moment my son's moral compass shattered and reformed into something unrecognizable. Marjorie had been living with us for 3 weeks at that point. I remember thinking she seemed harmless enough, a lonely widow who wanted to be near her daughter. I had no idea that her arrival marked the beginning of the final phase of a plan that had been years in the making. Ethan had come downstairs late that night, unable to sleep. The recording began with the sound of his footsteps on the stairs, then paused as he heard voices coming from the kitchen. Vanessa and Marjorie were speaking in low tones, clearly believing everyone else in the house was asleep. "The isolation needs to happen gradually," Marjorie was saying. "If you cut him off from his friends too quickly, he'll notice and push back. But if you do it slowly, one relationship at a time, he won't even realize what's happening until it's too late." "I've already started," Vanessa replied. "I told the Hendersons that Robert isn't feeling well and needs rest. They won't call for at least a month. By then, I'll have another excuse ready." "Good. What about his finances?" "I'm working on it. I convinced him to let me help with the household accounts. Once I have access to his passwords, I can start redirecting things. The investment accounts will take longer, but I have a plan for that too." The recording captured Ethan's sharp intake of breath, barely audible but unmistakable. He had stumbled onto the truth about his wife and mother-in-law, laid out in explicit detail. For a moment, I allowed myself to imagine that this was when he decided to warn me. That the son I had raised would hear these words and choose loyalty over complicity. But that is not what happened. "What about Ethan?" Vanessa asked on the recording. "He's been asking questions about Dad's accounts." Marjorie laughed softly. "Ethan will do whatever you tell him. He's weak, Vanessa. You knew that when you married him. Weak men are useful because they don't cause problems. Just keep him comfortable, and he'll stay out of your way." There was a pause, and then Vanessa's voice again, lower and colder than I had ever heard it. "And when we've got everything under control? What happens to Robert then?" "Then we push him out," Marjorie said simply. "Make life uncomfortable enough that he leaves on his own, or create a situation where we have no choice but to remove him. Either way, once he's gone, everything becomes ours. The house, the investments, all of it. Eleanor is dead. Ethan is controllable. Robert is the only obstacle, and old men don't last forever." The recording ended shortly after that, with the sound of Ethan retreating back up the stairs. He had heard everything. He knew exactly what his wife and mother-in-law were planning. He understood that his own father was being targeted for financial abuse and eventual displacement, and he did nothing. I have spent many hours trying to understand what went through Ethan's mind that night. The son I raised, the boy who had cried when his goldfish died, the young man who had promised at his mother's funeral to always take care of me. How did that person hear such a conversation and choose silence? The answer, I eventually realized, was fear. Not fear of Vanessa or Marjorie, though they were formidable in their own ways. Fear of disruption, fear of conflict, fear of having to rebuild a life that had become comfortable precisely because he never had to fight for anything. Ethan had always taken the path of least resistance, and confronting his wife about her schemes would have required more courage than he possessed. So instead, he made a different choice. A choice that was purely, perfectly Ethan. He began to document. The first file in his insurance folder was the recording from that night. Over the following weeks and months, he added to the collection with methodical precision. He screenshotted text messages between Vanessa and Marjorie, capturing their discussions of strategy and timeline. He recorded conversations when they thought he was in another room, using his phone's voice memo function to preserve every incriminating word. He photographed financial documents, saved, forwarded emails, and created a comprehensive archive of their conspiracy. 847 files. Bank statements showing unauthorized transfers, emails discussing how to intercept my mail, recordings of Marjorie coaching Vanessa on how to gaslight me into doubting my own memory, screenshots of text conversations celebrating each small victory in their campaign to isolate me. Every piece of evidence was time-stamped, organized, and backed up to a cloud server that neither woman knew existed. Ethan had created an airtight case, documenting elder abuse, financial exploitation, and conspiracy. If anyone ever investigated what had happened to me, the truth was all there, preserved in digital amber. But he never showed it to anyone. He never sent it to the police, or to a lawyer, or to me. He simply collected and waited, building his insurance policy against the day when he might need to prove that he was a victim rather than a villain. For 2 years, my son watched them destroy my life one piece at a time. For 2 years, he had the power to stop it with a single phone call. For 2 years, he chose his comfort over my safety, his security over my dignity, his cowardice over his conscience. He wasn't brave enough to be good, but he was smart enough to keep receipts. 2 weeks after the legal notice arrived, Vanessa made her boldest move yet. She called me at the motel where I had been staying with Buddy, her voice sweet as honey and twice as thick. "Robert, I think we've let this situation get out of hand," she said. "We're family. We should be able to talk through our differences like adults. Why don't you come to dinner on Saturday? I'm inviting a few friends, people who care about you. Let's clear the air and find a way forward." I knew it was a trap. Every instinct I had developed over 68 years of life screamed at me to decline. But Marcus Whitfield had advised me to document everything, to give them rope and let them hang themselves with it. And some part of me, the part that still hoped I was wrong about the depth of their malice, wanted to see exactly how far Vanessa was willing to go. "I'll be there," I said. Saturday evening arrived cold and clear. I drove to the house that had been my home for over 40 years, parking on the street like a visitor. Through the windows, I could see figures moving, candles lit on the dining table, the warm glow of a gathering in progress. For a moment, I allowed myself to imagine that this was real, that Vanessa genuinely wanted reconciliation, that my son might finally stand up and acknowledge what had been done. Then I walked inside and understood exactly what kind of evening this would be. The dining room held 8 people. Vanessa and Ethan sat at the head of the table, playing the role of gracious hosts. Marjorie occupied a seat of honor near her daughter. The remaining guests were couples I recognized from the neighborhood, people Eleanor and I had known for years. The Pattersons, who had attended our anniversary parties. The Reinhardts, who had brought casseroles after Eleanor's funeral. The Dawsons, who had always waved when they passed our house on their evening walks. They looked at me with expressions I had never seen before. Concern, pity, the careful watchfulness of people who have been warned that someone might behave erratically. "Robert, I'm so glad you could make it," Vanessa said, rising to greet me with a hug that felt like a performance. "Please, sit down. We were just talking about you." I took the empty seat at the far end of the table, as distant from the hosts as the arrangement allowed. The conversation resumed around me, but I noticed how the other guests avoided engaging me directly. They spoke to each other, to Vanessa, to Marjorie, but their eyes kept drifting toward me with that same worried expression. Halfway through the main course, Vanessa set down her fork and cleared her throat. The table fell silent. "I want to thank everyone for coming tonight," she began, her voice trembling with rehearsed emotion. "As you know, our family has been going through a difficult time. Robert has been struggling since Eleanor's passing, and lately, we've noticed some concerning changes." She paused, dabbing at her eyes with a napkin. Marjorie reached over to pat her daughter's hand supportively. "My father-in-law has been confused lately," Vanessa continued. "He's been making accusations, saying things that don't make sense, behaving erratically. It's been heartbreaking to watch. We've tried to help him, but he's pushed us away at every turn." She looked around the table, making eye contact with each guest in turn. "We're looking into memory care facilities. It's not what we wanted, but we have to accept that Robert may need more support than we can provide at home. I just wanted you all to know, so you understand if he says anything tonight that seems off." The guests nodded sympathetically. The Pattersons murmured about how hard this must be. The Reinhardts exchanged knowing glances. The Dawsons looked at me with the kind of gentle pity reserved for the elderly and infirm. I said nothing. Ethan sat frozen beside his wife, his eyes fixed on his plate. He did not nod along with her lies. He did not meet anyone's gaze. But he did not contradict her either. He simply sat there, complicit in his silence, while his wife painted me as a senile old man losing his grip on reality. The dinner continued, but I had stopped listening. I watched Vanessa work the room, playing the concerned daughter-in-law forced to make difficult decisions. I watched Marjorie support the performance with sighs and sad smiles. I watched my son, my only child, say nothing while his father was publicly degraded. When the dessert plates were cleared, I stood up slowly. The conversation stopped. "Thank you all for coming," I said, my voice steady. "It was good to see old friends." I walked toward the door. Behind me, I heard Vanessa laugh, a brittle sound that barely concealed her triumph. "See," she said to the guests, "he can't even defend himself anymore. That's what I've been dealing with. He just shuts down when confronted with reality." I stopped at the doorway. Vanessa was still smiling, basking in the success of her performance. I turned and walked back to where she sat, leaning down so that only she could hear my words. "Eleanor warned me about you," I whispered. "She saw exactly what you were, years before I did. I should have listened sooner." I straightened and walked out without looking back. But in that brief moment, I had seen something I had never witnessed before on Vanessa's face. Uncertainty, perhaps even fear. She had prepared for anger. She had prepared for denial. She had prepared for the broken old man she believed me to be. She had not prepared for calm. The Monday after the dinner party, I sat in Marcus Whitfield's office and gave him a single instruction. "Begin." Marcus nodded and reached for his phone. What followed over the next 72 hours was the systematic dismantling of everything Vanessa and Marjorie had built on the foundation of my life. I did not witness it directly, but the recordings Ethan made during that time captured every moment of their collapse. The first sign of trouble came Tuesday morning. Vanessa went to the grocery store, filled her cart with the expensive items she had grown accustomed to buying with money that was never hers, and presented her credit card at the checkout. The machine declined it. She tried a second card, then a third. All declined. "There must be some mistake," she told the cashier, her voice tight with embarrassment. "These accounts are active, I used them yesterday, but there was no mistake. As successor trustee of the Eleanor Finch Living Trust, Marcus had the authority to manage all assets held within it. That authority included freezing the joint checking account that had been funded by monthly transfers from the trust. It included revoking the authorized user status on credit cards tied to trust accounts. It included, as Vanessa would soon discover, much more. She drove home in a fury, already composing the angry phone calls she would make to banks and financial institutions. But when she turned onto her street, she found a flatbed tow truck parked in the driveway. Two men in uniforms were attaching chains to her Mercedes, the silver sedan she had driven for 3 years without ever considering who actually owned it. "What are you doing?" she screamed, jumping out of her car. "That's my vehicle. You can't take it." One of the men, weathered and unimpressed by her outrage, handed her a document. "Ma'am, this vehicle is titled to the Eleanor Finch Living Trust. We've been instructed by the trustee to repossess it. You're welcome to contest this in court, but for now, the car comes with us." Vanessa snatched the paper and read it with trembling hands. The letterhead bore Marcus Whitfield's name, and the language was unambiguous. The Mercedes, like the house she stood in front of, had never belonged to her or Ethan. It belonged to Eleanor's trust, and the trust was reclaiming its property. The recording Ethan made that afternoon captured the aftermath. Vanessa stormed into the house, where Marjorie was waiting in the living room, and the two women faced the first real challenge to their carefully constructed plan. "What is happening?" Marjorie demanded. "This wasn't supposed to be possible. You told me everything was under control." "It was under control," Vanessa shouted. "We had access to all the accounts. We were managing everything. How can they just freeze our money and take our car?" "Because it was never our money," Marjorie said slowly, the realization dawning on her face. "It was never our car. Everything came through that trust, and we never actually owned any of it." For the first time in all the recordings I would eventually hear, Marjorie sounded afraid. Not angry, not calculating, not dismissive. Afraid. The woman who had spent decades teaching her daughter to control everything was confronting a situation she could not control. Vanessa spent the rest of that day on the phone with lawyers. She called 3 different firms, explaining the situation and demanding to know her options. Each conversation ended the same way. The trust documents were legitimate, executed properly, and completely legal. Eleanor had every right to structure her assets as she saw fit. The beneficiary agreement Ethan had signed gave the trustee explicit authority to terminate beneficiary status under specific conditions, and those conditions had been met the night they threw me into the rain. "There must be something we can do," Vanessa pleaded with the third attorney. "Some way to challenge this. They can't just take everything." "Mrs. Finch," the lawyer replied, his voice professionally sympathetic, "I've reviewed the documents you sent me. This trust was crafted by someone who knew exactly what they were doing. Every clause is enforceable. Every contingency anticipated. Whoever set this up spent years thinking through every possible scenario. I'm sorry, but my advice is to negotiate. Fighting this in court will only drain whatever personal resources you have left." When Vanessa hung up the phone, the house was silent. Marjorie sat in a chair by the window, staring at nothing. Vanessa paced the living room, her heels clicking against the hardwood floors that suddenly felt like borrowed ground. And somewhere in another room, Ethan was checking his email. The message from Marcus Whitfield arrived at 4:17 that afternoon. It was brief and formal, the kind of communication that lawyers send when they want everything documented. "Dear Mr. Finch," it read, "your father requests a meeting to discuss the current situation and potential paths forward. This invitation is extended to you alone. If you are interested in attending, please reply to this email with your availability. The meeting will take place at my office at a time of your choosing." Ethan read the message 3 times. Then he closed his laptop and sat in the gathering darkness of the study, trying to understand what it meant. His father wanted to see him. Not Vanessa, not Marjorie. Him. Alone. After everything that had happened, after the storm night and the legal notices and the repossessed car, Robert Finch was reaching out specifically to his son. It could be an ambush, Ethan thought, a chance for his father to unleash years of suppressed anger in a private setting. It could be a legal trap, something Marcus was engineering to extract damaging admissions. It could be the end of any possibility of reconciliation, a final door slamming shut, or it could be something else entirely. Ethan thought about the insurance folder on his laptop, the 847 files he had accumulated over 2 years. He thought about the recordings that captured every incriminating word his wife and mother-in-law had spoken. He thought about the evidence that could prove he was not the architect of this scheme, merely its weak and willing accomplice. He thought about his father, alone in some motel room with only a dog for company, driven out of his own home by people who claimed to love him. The dominoes were falling. Everything Vanessa and Marjorie had built was collapsing around them, and Ethan was standing in the middle of the wreckage. He had to decide which side of the collapse he wanted to be on. The day before Ethan received that email, I sat in Marcus Whitfield's office for what he called a full disclosure meeting. Until that point, I had only seen fragments of what Eleanor had built. The trust documents, the beneficiary agreement, the legal mechanisms that were now dismantling Vanessa's comfortable life piece by piece. But Marcus had been waiting for the right moment to show me everything, and he had decided that moment had arrived. "Robert," he said, closing the door to his office and gesturing for me to sit, "your wife was one of the most remarkable people I've ever worked with. In 30 years of estate law, I've never seen anyone plan as thoroughly as she did." He opened a cabinet behind his desk and withdrew a thick binder, easily 3 inches of documents organized with colored tabs. He set it on the desk between us. "This is the complete Eleanor Finch estate plan," he said. "Every asset you accumulated during your marriage is accounted for here. Every contingency she could imagine is addressed. She spent 2 years building this, refining it, making sure there were no gaps." I reached for the binder, but Marcus held up his hand. "Before you look through this, I need to tell you how it started. How Eleanor knew to begin preparing in the first place." He leaned back in his chair, his expression softening with something like admiration. 4 years ago, Eleanor came to see me for what she called an initial consultation. She said she had concerns about her daughter-in-law, but nothing concrete, just a feeling, an instinct that something was wrong. I told her that instincts weren't enough to build a legal strategy around. She agreed and said she would keep watching. Marcus paused, gathering his thoughts. 3 months later, she came back. This time, she had something specific. Your son had mentioned an email to her, apparently thinking nothing of it. He said his mother-in-law had written to Vanessa about being ready when the old man goes. Those were the exact words. Being ready when the old man goes. My stomach tightened. Ethan had known about that email 4 years ago. He had mentioned it to his mother casually, as if it were nothing. And Eleanor, sharp as always, had understood exactly what it meant. "She never confronted anyone," Marcus continued. "She never told you. She simply came to me and said she needed to protect her husband from her own family. Those were her words. She asked me to help her build something that couldn't be broken, something that would be waiting if and when she was proven right." He gestured to the binder. "This is what we built. The trust holds everything. The house, the vehicles, the investment accounts, the life insurance policies. Your name is on all of it as the primary beneficiary, with specific protections that cannot be overridden. Ethan was included as a secondary beneficiary, but only under conditions that Eleanor designed to test his character. The clause about forcing me from the house," I said. "That's the most obvious one. But there are others. If Ethan ever attempted to have you declared incompetent without legitimate medical basis, his beneficiary status would terminate. If he ever tried to sell or mortgage the property without your explicit consent, terminated. If he ever restricted your access to your own financial information, terminated." Marcus shook his head slowly. "She thought of everything, Robert. Every way they might try to take advantage of you. She anticipated and blocked. She was preparing for a war she hoped would never come, but she refused to leave you undefended." I sat in silence, overwhelmed by the scope of what Eleanor had done. While I was holding her hand through treatments, while I was measuring her medication and helping her to the bathroom and watching her grow weaker by the day, she had been building a fortress around me. She had been fighting a battle I didn't even know existed. "There's one more thing," Marcus said. He turned to his computer and clicked through several folders. "Eleanor recorded this about 6 months before she passed. She asked me to show it to you only if the worst happened, only if she was right about Vanessa." He turned the monitor so I could see it clearly, then pressed play. Eleanor's face appeared on the screen. She was thin by then, her cheeks hollowed by illness, but her eyes were as sharp as ever. She was sitting in what looked like Marcus's office, the same room where I now sat. She looked directly at the camera, directly at me, and began to speak. "Robert, my love, if you're watching this, then they did exactly what I predicted. I'm so sorry. I'm sorry I couldn't protect you in person. I'm sorry I couldn't be there to stand beside you when they showed their true colors. Her voice trembled slightly, but she pressed on. I want you to know that I saw this coming. I saw who Vanessa really is, and I saw what Marjorie made her. I wanted to tell you, but I knew you wouldn't believe me. You always want to see the best in people, especially in Ethan. It's one of the things I love most about you. But this time, that kindness would have been used against you. She paused, composing herself. So I protected you the only way I knew how. Everything you need is here, with Marcus. The legal documents, the financial protections, all of it. Use them. Don't feel guilty about fighting back. These people tried to take everything we built together, and they don't deserve your mercy. Eleanor leaned closer to the camera, her eyes glistening. I love you, Robert. I have loved you since the day we met, and I will love you long after I'm gone. Please don't spend too much time grieving for me. Live your life. Find happiness. And know that even when I couldn't be with you anymore, I never stopped trying to protect you. The video ended. The screen went dark. I sat motionless in my chair, tears streaming down my face. I had not cried since Eleanor's funeral. I had not allowed myself to feel the full weight of losing her. But now, seeing her face again, hearing her voice, understanding the depth of her love and foresight, something inside me finally broke open. She knew. She always knew. And she never stopped protecting me. Ethan came to Marcus Whitfield's office 3 days after receiving the invitation. I watched him enter the building from a window on the 3rd floor, his shoulders hunched against a cold wind, his face drawn with sleeplessness and worry. He looked older than his 45 years, diminished somehow, as if the collapse of his comfortable life had physically shrunk him. Marcus showed him into the conference room where I was waiting. Ethan stopped in the doorway when he saw me, uncertainty flickering across his features. I gestured to the chair across from mine. Sit down, Ethan. We have things to discuss. He sat. Marcus closed the door and took a position near the window, present but unobtrusive. For a long moment, neither Ethan nor I spoke. I studied my son's face, searching for some trace of the boy I had raised, the child who had once looked at me with uncomplicated love and trust. I know about your insurance folder, I said finally. 847 files. 2 years of documentation. Ethan's face went pale. How did you? It doesn't matter how. What matters is that you had the evidence to stop this at any point. You chose not to use it. He opened his mouth to defend himself. But I raised my hand. I didn't bring you here to relitigate your failures. I brought you here because there's something you need to see. Something that might help you understand what you've been part of. I slid a folder across the table. Inside was a printout of an email dated 4 years earlier. Ethan recognized it immediately. I could tell by the way his breath caught, by the slight widening of his eyes. You mentioned this email to your mother, I said, casually as if it meant nothing. You told her that Marjorie had written to Vanessa about being ready when the old man goes. Do you remember? Ethan nodded slowly, his eyes fixed on the printout. Eleanor never forgot those words. She came to Marcus the next week and began building the trust that is now protecting me from your wife. Your careless comment saved me, Ethan. The irony is not lost on me. I let him read the full email. Marjorie's words were stark on the page, stripped of any pretense. The old man won't live forever. Make sure you're in position when he goes. This is what I raised you for. This is what I raised you for, Ethan repeated quietly. She wrote that to Vanessa. Your mother-in-law has been planning this for years. Long before Eleanor got sick. Long before you moved into my house. Vanessa didn't wake up one day and decide to steal from her father-in-law. She was trained for this, programmed. Marjorie has been shaping her for decades. I told him then what Marcus had uncovered during his investigation. The story of Marjorie Collins, born Marjorie Hensley, who had married young and trusted completely. Her husband Donald had seemed like a good man, a provider, someone who would take care of her and their daughter. For 18 years, Marjorie had believed in that marriage. Then Donald met someone else, a younger woman, a colleague at his office, someone who made him feel alive again. He didn't just leave Marjorie. He systematically dismantled her life before walking out the door. He emptied their joint accounts. He transferred the house to his own name and then sold it. He canceled credit cards she didn't know were in his name alone. By the time the divorce was final, Marjorie had nothing but a 7-year-old daughter and the clothes on her back. She spent 2 years in a shelter for displaced women, 2 years of food pantries and donated clothing, and the slow, grinding humiliation of having trusted someone who destroyed her. When she finally clawed her way back to stability, she made a vow. Her daughter would never be that vulnerable. Her daughter would never depend on anyone. Her daughter would learn to control everything before it could control her. Vanessa was Marjorie's project. Every lesson, every piece of advice, every moment of maternal guidance had been aimed at creating a woman who would never be caught unprepared. Marry someone weak. Position yourself to control the assets. Never let sentiment interfere with security. Vanessa had absorbed these teachings so completely that she probably didn't even recognize them as programming anymore. She thought these were her own beliefs, her own choices, her own nature. Your wife is not entirely a villain, I said to Ethan. She's also a victim, in her own way. Marjorie created her, shaped her, aimed her like a weapon. That doesn't excuse what she's done to me, but it complicates the picture. Ethan sat in silence, processing what he had heard. I could see him reorganizing his understanding of his own marriage, reconsidering conversations and decisions that suddenly looked different in this new light. I need to tell Vanessa, he said finally. She needs to know what her mother did to her. She may already know, or she may not want to know. People resist the truth when it threatens their sense of themselves. I watched my son wrestle with this new information, and I felt something I had not expected. Not forgiveness, certainly, but perhaps the beginning of understanding. Ethan was weak, just as Eleanor had written. But weakness is not the same as malice. He had failed me out of cowardice, not cruelty. It was a distinction worth noting, even if it didn't erase the hurt. There's one more thing, I said. I've been thinking about what happens next. The trust gives me options. I could pursue this to the fullest extent of the law. I could ensure that Vanessa and Marjorie face consequences for what they've done. I could cut you out entirely and never speak to you again. Ethan looked up, fear naked in his eyes. But Eleanor asked me to give you a chance. One chance to prove that you're still my son, not just their accomplice. I'm going to honor her request. I leaned forward, holding his gaze. I'm going to give you one last chance, Ethan. Make it count. Ethan returned to Marcus Whitfield's office 1 week later. I had given him time to think, to process what he had learned about Marjorie and Vanessa, to decide what kind of man he wanted to be. When he walked through the door this time, he was carrying a small object in his hand, clutching it the way a drowning man clutches a piece of driftwood, a USB drive. Black plastic, unremarkable, small enough to fit in a pocket. The repository of 2 years of carefully documented betrayal. I want to give you this, Ethan said, setting it on the table between us. His voice was steadier than it had been at our last meeting, though I could still see the fear beneath his composure. Everything is on here. Every recording, every screenshot, every email I saved. All 847 files. I looked at the drive but did not touch it. Why now? Because you were right. About Marjorie, about Vanessa, about all of it. I went home after our last meeting and I watched them. Really watched them. For the first time in years. I saw how Marjorie gives the orders and Vanessa follows them. I saw how every decision I thought my wife made on her own was actually directed by her mother. I've been living in a puppet show and I didn't even realize I was one of the puppets. He pushed the drive closer to me. I should have given you this a long time ago. I should have stopped them when I first found out what they were planning. I know that. But I was scared, Dad. I was scared of losing everything. The house, the money, Vanessa. I told myself that if I just kept my head down, it would all work out somehow. That they wouldn't really hurt you, not seriously. That I could protect you without having to actually do anything. Ethan's voice cracked on the last words. He looked down at his hands, unable to meet my eyes. I was wrong. I was a coward, and I'm sorry. I let the silence stretch between us. Outside the window, traffic moved along the street below, people going about their ordinary lives, unaware of the small drama unfolding in this conference room. Marcus Whitfield sat in the corner, a silent witness, his face professionally neutral. Finally, I picked up the USB drive. It weighed almost nothing, this tiny object that contained so much evidence of cruelty and manipulation. I turned it over in my fingers, considering what it represented. You had this for 2 years, I said quietly. 2 years, Ethan. 730 days, give or take. Do you have any idea what those 2 years were like for me? He shook his head, still not looking up. I watched my world shrink. My friends stopped calling because your wife told them I was too ill for visitors. My mail disappeared because she redirected it. My bank accounts were drained because she convinced me to give her access. I became a stranger in my own home, a guest who was tolerated rather than welcomed, and eventually not even that. I set the drive down on the table. You watched them plan all of this. You listened to them strategize about how to isolate me, control me, push me out. You recorded every conversation, saved every email, documented every step of their scheme. You had the power to stop it at any point. One phone call to me, one visit to a lawyer, one moment of courage. I looked directly at my son, forcing him to meet my eyes, and you did nothing. Ethan's face crumpled. I was scared, he repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. I didn't know what to do. Vanessa can be so convincing, and Marjorie, she has this way of making everything seem reasonable. I kept telling myself it wasn't that bad, that you were fine, that I was overreacting. You knew exactly what to do, I said. You knew the right thing was to warn me, to stop them, to choose your father over your comfort. You didn't fail to act because you were confused. You failed to act because acting would have cost you something, and you weren't willing to pay that price. The truth of it hung in the air between us, undeniable and harsh. Ethan had no defense against it because there was no defense. He had made his choice, day after day for 2 years. And now he had to live with what that choice revealed about his character. I'm going to use this evidence, I said, picking up the drive again. Marcus will review it and incorporate it into our legal strategy. It will help ensure that Vanessa and Marjorie face appropriate consequences for what they've done. In that sense, you've done something useful. Ethan looked up, a flicker of hope in his eyes. But I want you to understand something, I continued. This is not redemption. Handing me this drive does not erase 2 years of complicity. It does not restore the relationship we once had. It does not mean I've forgiven you or that I trust you or that things between us will ever be what they were before. I watched the hope fade from his face, replaced by something more complicated. Pain, certainly, but also, perhaps, the beginning of understanding. This might be your last chance to show me who you really are, I said. Your last opportunity to prove that somewhere inside the man you've become, there's still some trace of the son I raised. But don't confuse giving me evidence with earning my forgiveness. Those are two very different things. Ethan sat in silence for a long moment, absorbing my words. When he finally spoke, his voice was small and uncertain. What do you mean, last chance? What are you going to ask me to do? I looked at my son, this weak man who had stood by while his wife and mother-in-law dismantled my life. I thought about Eleanor's letter, her request that I give him one opportunity to prove her wrong. I thought about the choice I was about to offer him, and whether he had the strength to make the right decision. You'll find out soon enough, I said. Go home. Think about what matters to you. And when I call, be ready to answer. I called Ethan 5 days later and asked him to meet me at a small park near the motel where Buddy and I had been staying. It was a neutral space, away from lawyers and offices and the weight of legal documents. I wanted this conversation to happen between a father and his son, nothing more. He arrived early, which surprised me. Ethan had never been punctual in his life. I found him sitting on a bench near the pond, watching ducks glide across the water, his hands clasped between his knees. He looked like a man waiting for a verdict. I sat down beside him. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The October sun was warm despite the season, and Buddy lay at my feet, content to rest after our morning walk. I've made a decision, I said finally, about what happens next. Ethan turned to look at me, his face a mixture of hope and dread. The trust gives me significant discretion over how assets are distributed. Marcus has confirmed that I can modify the terms within certain limits Eleanor established. What that means is that I have a choice to make about your future. I paused, choosing my next words carefully. I can restore part of the trust for you. Not everything, but enough to live comfortably for the rest of your life. A house, a reasonable income, security. You wouldn't be wealthy, but you would never have to worry about money. Ethan's eyes widened. Dad, there's a condition. He fell silent, waiting. Leave Vanessa. File for divorce and see it through. Cut all ties with Marjorie. I don't mean reduced contact or managed holidays. I mean completely and permanently out of your life. Both of them. I turned to face my son directly. Come back to me. Not as their accomplice. Not as the weak man who stood by while they hurt me, but as my son. Start over. We can try to rebuild what's left of our relationship. It won't be easy, and I can't promise I'll ever fully trust you again. But I'm willing to try if you are. Ethan stared at me, his mouth slightly open. I could see him processing the offer, turning it over in his mind, examining it from every angle. That's one option, I continued. Here's the other. I kept my voice steady, though what I was about to say cost me more than he would ever know. Keep your wife. Keep your mother-in-law. Keep the life you've chosen, whatever that looks like now, and lose me forever. No inheritance from the trust, not a single dollar. No relationship with me, no phone calls, no visits, no presence at my funeral when that day comes. No second chances after this. You will be, for all practical purposes, no longer my son. Ethan's face had gone pale. His hands trembled slightly in his lap. Dad, he said, his voice cracking. You're asking me to destroy my entire life. Everything I've built for 20 years. My marriage, my home, my family. No, I said quietly. I'm asking you to choose, something you've avoided doing your entire life. I stood up from the bench, and Buddy rose with me, ever attentive to my movements. You've spent 45 years taking the path of least resistance, Ethan. Letting other people make decisions for you because it was easier than making them yourself. Letting Vanessa control your household because confrontation was uncomfortable. Letting Marjorie pull the strings because standing up to her required courage you didn't have. I looked down at my son, seeing him clearly perhaps for the first time. This is the moment where you decide who you actually are. Not who you've been pretending to be. Not who other people made you, but who you choose to be when everything is on the line. I can't make this decision for you. No one can. It has to be yours. Ethan sat frozen on the bench, unable to speak. Take whatever time you need, I said. But understand that when you give me your answer, it will be final. There's no negotiating, no compromise, no middle ground. You choose Vanessa and Marjorie, or you choose me. That's all there is. I walked away with Buddy at my side, leaving my son alone with the weight of his decision. I did not look back. Whatever happened next was in his hands. That evening, Ethan returned to the house that was no longer his. Vanessa was waiting in the living room, her face tight with anxiety. The past weeks had aged her, stripped away some of the polished confidence that had always been her armor. What did he want? She demanded as Ethan walked through the door. What did your father say? Ethan looked at his wife. The woman he had married 20 years ago. The woman who had systematically destroyed his relationship with his father. The woman whose mother had programmed her to be exactly what she was. He did not answer. He walked past her without a word, climbed the stairs to the bedroom, and closed the door behind him. 3 days passed without a word from Ethan. I spent them quietly, walking Buddy along the beach near the motel, sitting in Marcus Whitfield's office, reviewing documents, and trying not to think about what my son was deciding. I had said what needed to be said. The rest was up to him. The recordings Ethan made during those 3 days told the story of a man being pulled apart by competing forces. Vanessa had sensed immediately that something significant had happened at our meeting in the park. She spent the first evening demanding answers, her voice rising with each unanswered question. He's manipulating you, she insisted when Ethan finally told her the broad strokes of my offer. That's what this is. He knows we'll fight the trust in court, so he's trying to divide us. Don't you see? If you leave me, he wins. He gets exactly what he wants. Marjorie took a different approach. Her voice on the recording was calm, almost maternal. The tone of a woman who had spent decades perfecting the art of control. Think about what you'd be throwing away, she said. 20 years of marriage, the life you've built, everything we've worked for. And for what? An old man who's already proven he doesn't have your best interests at heart? He put conditions on his love. Ethan, what kind of father does that? I listened to that recording later and felt a cold anger settle in my chest. Marjorie had spent years conditioning Vanessa to see love as a transaction, security as something to be seized rather than earned, and now she was using the same tactics on my son, reframing my offer as manipulation rather than what it truly was, a final chance for him to prove his character. The second day brought more of the same. Vanessa oscillated between anger and desperation, threatening divorce one moment and pleading for unity the next. Marjorie remained steadfast in her counsel, urging Ethan to call my bluff, insisting that I would never actually follow through on my ultimatum. But Ethan said almost nothing. The recordings captured long silences, broken only by the women's voices and the ambient sounds of a household in crisis. My son was paralyzed, caught between the life he knew and the father he had betrayed, unable to move in either direction. On the morning of the third day, my phone rang. I looked at the screen and saw Ethan's name. I answered without speaking, waiting for him to find his words. "Dad." His voice was hollow, emptied of everything except exhaustion and resignation. "I've thought about what you said. I've thought about nothing else for 3 days." I remained silent, giving him space to continue. "I can't leave her." The words came out in a rush, as if he needed to say them quickly before he lost his nerve. "I'm sorry, Dad. I know that's not what you wanted to hear. But I can't start over. I'm 45 years old. I don't know how to be alone. I don't know who I am without this life, even if this life is broken." He paused, and I could hear him struggling to breathe. "I'm not strong enough," he said finally. "I never have been. You and Mom, you always hoped I would grow into something more. But this is who I am. I'm weak. I've always been weak, and I can't become someone different just because you're asking me to." I sat with the phone pressed to my ear, looking out the window at the parking lot of the motel. Buddy lay at my feet, watching me with those patient eyes. The silence stretched between us, father and son, separated by so much more than distance. "I know," I said at last. "I think I always knew." There was nothing more to say. I ended the call and set the phone down on the nightstand. Then I called Marcus Whitfield and told him to proceed with everything we had discussed. The consequences unfolded over the following months with the methodical precision Eleanor had built into her plans. The trust formally terminated Ethan's beneficiary status, removing any legal claim he might have had to the assets. The house was listed for sale, and despite Vanessa's attempts to block the process, it sold within 6 weeks to a young family who knew nothing of its history. The proceeds went to a charitable foundation Eleanor had specified in the trust documents, an organization that supported victims of elder abuse. Marjorie was forced to leave within 30 days of the sale. She moved to Florida, where a sister she had not spoken to in 15 years reluctantly offered a spare bedroom. From what I learned later, the arrangement was barely tolerable for either of them. Marjorie, who had spent her life controlling everyone around her, found herself dependent on someone who owed her nothing and resented her presence. Vanessa and Ethan rented a small apartment on the other side of town. It was clean and adequate, but a far cry from the home they had occupied for 3 years. Without access to the trust funds, they were forced to live on Ethan's modest salary and whatever Vanessa could earn at a job she took reluctantly after years of not working. The marriage, such as it was, did not survive the transition. 3 months after they moved into the apartment, Vanessa filed for divorce. The paperwork cited irreconcilable differences, but the truth was simpler. Ethan was no longer useful to her. Without the prospect of inheritance, without the comfortable life she had schemed to secure, he was just a weak man with a mediocre income and no prospects. Marjorie had taught her daughter never to depend on anyone, and Vanessa was finally taking that lesson to its logical conclusion. I learned about the divorce from Marcus, who kept tabs on the situation as a matter of professional diligence. I felt nothing when he told me. Whatever grief I might have had for my son's failed marriage had been spent long ago. A week after the divorce was finalized, my phone buzzed with a text message. I looked at the screen and saw Ethan's name. "You gave me an impossible choice." I read the words twice. Then I set the phone down and went for a walk on the beach with Buddy, leaving the message unanswered. Some choices only seem impossible to those who lack the courage to make them. 6 months have passed since I walked away from the life I thought I knew. I am writing this from the porch of a small cottage overlooking the Atlantic, watching Buddy chase seagulls across the sand as the morning sun climbs over the horizon. The air smells of salt and possibility, and for the first time in years, I wake each day without dread. The cottage was not part of Eleanor's trust. I bought it with money from the sale of our old house, the portion that the trust allocated for my personal use. It has 2 bedrooms, a kitchen with windows facing the water, and a porch wide enough for a rocking chair and an old dog who has earned his rest. It is more than enough. The chaos is behind me now. The legal battles are settled, the documents filed, the assets distributed according to Eleanor's meticulous instructions. Marcus Whitfield calls occasionally to update me on administrative matters, but mostly I am left alone with my thoughts and my dog and the endless rhythm of the waves. I have not been idle during these months. Eleanor's protection saved me, and I decided that her legacy should extend beyond our marriage to help others who face what I faced. With Marcus's assistance, I established the Eleanor Finch Foundation, a nonprofit organization dedicated to supporting elderly people who suffer financial abuse at the hands of family members. We provide legal assistance, temporary housing, and counseling services to those who have been betrayed by the people they trusted most. The foundation has already helped dozens of people, men and women in their 70s and 80s who were manipulated by children and grandchildren, stripped of their savings and dignity by those who should have protected them. When I meet with them, I see my own story reflected in their eyes. I tell them what I wish someone had told me: you are not alone, and you are not powerless. Eleanor would have loved this work. She spent her final years building walls to protect me, and now those walls shelter others as well. Her name is on every document, every letterhead, every check we write. She continues to save people even from beyond the grave. I keep track of what happened to those who tried to destroy me, though I take no particular pleasure in their fates. Vanessa works as an office manager at a real estate company across town. It is her first real job in over 20 years, and from what I understand, she struggles with the adjustment. The woman who once orchestrated the takeover of my home now answers phones and schedules appointments for people who have no idea what she is capable of. Marjorie remains in Florida, living in her sister's spare bedroom. The sister, a woman named Dorothy who never approved of Marjorie's scheming, tolerates her presence but offers little warmth. Marjorie, who spent her life controlling everyone around her, now depends on the charity of someone who owes her nothing. I am told she rarely leaves the house. Ethan drifts somewhere in between. The divorce left him with almost nothing, and he has moved into a small apartment near his workplace. He still has his job, still earns his modest salary, still goes through the motions of a life. But from what Marcus tells me, he has become a ghost of himself, hollowed out by the consequences of choices he was too weak to unmake. He called me on Father's Day. I was sitting on this same porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink, when my phone buzzed with his name. I looked at the screen for a long moment, watching it ring. I thought about answering. I thought about what I might say to the son who had stood by while his wife and mother-in-law dismantled my life. I thought about Eleanor's request that I give him a chance. I let it go to voicemail. He did not leave a message. Perhaps there was nothing left to say. I had given him his chance, and he had made his choice. Some doors, once closed, cannot be reopened. The sun has nearly set now. Buddy has returned from his adventures on the beach and lies at my feet, his gray muzzle resting on my shoe. I reach down to scratch behind his ears, feeling the steady rhythm of his breathing. He has been my constant companion through all of this, the one living creature who never betrayed me, never schemed against me, never chose comfort over loyalty. In my other hand, I hold a photograph. Eleanor at 23, radiant in her wedding dress, her hand clasped in mine. We were so young then, so certain that love would be enough to carry us through whatever life brought. We could not have imagined the challenges ahead, the joys and sorrows, the ultimate betrayal by our own son. But we faced it all together, even when she was no longer beside me. I turn the photograph over and read the words she wrote on the back, part of the letter she left me all those years ago. Her handwriting is faded but still legible, still carrying the echo of her voice. Live well, my love. That's the only revenge that matters. I look out at the ocean, vast and eternal, and I feel something I thought I had lost forever. Peace. Not the absence of pain, but the presence of something stronger. Purpose. Gratitude. The quiet satisfaction of having survived what was meant to break me. They thought it would be easy. Vanessa with her schemes, Marjorie with her manipulation, Ethan with his cowardice. They looked at me and saw an old man, alone and vulnerable, ripe for exploitation. They thought they could take everything I had built and leave me with nothing. They forgot that I had 43 years with a woman who prepared me for everything, even this. Robert Finch walked into that storm with nothing but his dog and his dignity. He walked out the other side with something far more valuable: the knowledge that he had been loved by a woman who saw the future and refused to leave him unprotected. Eleanor's gift was not just the trust she created or the legal fortress she built. It was the reminder that true love prepares for the worst while hoping for the best. This story is dedicated to everyone who has ever been underestimated because of their age. To the mothers and fathers who gave everything to their children, only to be cast aside when they were no longer convenient. To the widows and widowers who face the world alone, wondering if anyone still sees their worth. You are not invisible, you are not powerless, and you are never too old to fight for the respect you deserve. If this story touched your heart, I hope you will share it with someone who needs to hear it. A friend who is going through a difficult time with family, a parent who feels forgotten, a neighbor who might be facing something similar in silence. Stories like Robert's happen every day, and the more we talk about them, the more we can protect those we love. Thank you for listening until the very end. Your support means everything to this channel. Please leave a comment and tell me what you thought of Robert's journey. Did Eleanor's foresight surprise you? What would you have done in Ethan's position? I read every comment, and I cannot wait to hear your thoughts. Until next time, remember, living well is always the best revenge.